A question to begin. Why does the queer community get so excited about gay animals? In the last 20 years or so, pop culture keeps rediscovering homosexuality or same-sex mating behaviours in animals. And Tango Makes Three, a true story of two same-sex penguins who partner together and adopt an egg, is one of the most popular and most banned children's books. Elliot Page is narrating an upcoming documentary called Second Nature that's all about homosexuality and sex in wildlife. And in February, a story went viral about two male humpback whales engaging in sexual behaviour together. It got a lot of coverage with headlines like "Humpback whales photographed having sex" and "Gay sex for the first time." Humpback whales seen having gay sex for the first time ever. The first ever photos of humpback whales having sex had been taken, and it was a hot gay romp. And there was a lot of discussion around this homosexual humpback behaviour on social media as well, most notably Trixie Mattel posting a screenshot of the whales and captioning it with the F slur and then getting banned on Instagram, and just the most Instagram story of all time. Now let's be real, there is no such thing as a gay whale. But there's also no such thing as a straight whale. We can't project human sexuality onto non-humans, right? For one, behaviour doesn't equal identity. Sexuality and sexual activity are not the same thing. We don't know how that whale experiences attraction, or how he experiences gender or sexuality, or even sex for that matter, because he's a whale. Sexuality is, after all, a very human social construct. It's specific to our social systems. Yes, both humans and whales participate in some male-on-male action, but in completely different contexts. Still, even though these whales aren't gay, a lot of gay people really enjoyed this news story. Partly because it's kind of like a fun thing to make jokes about, partly because it's interesting from a scientific standpoint. But I also think that there's a deeper reason here. Take, for example, the comment section of this Frozen Planet clip, which follows an albatross and a same-sex pair bond. These viewers are not just projecting human queerness onto these animals, they're using animals to validate human queerness itself. How can homophobes say we're unnatural? We got lesbian birds. To truly understand why queer people love And Tango Makes Three and David Attenborough talking about lesbian seagulls, we have to look at the history of homophobic rhetoric. Going back as far as Thomas Aquinas, people have argued that any non-heterosexual behaviour in humans is unnatural because they believe, incorrectly, that non-heterosexual behaviour does not exist in non-humans, and so it's not natural. Queerness is therefore a corruption or betrayal of our natural state, aka the way God designed us. Therefore, queerness is wrong. This kind of rhetoric is both silly and incredibly effective. Despite its lack of scientific basis and its false equivalence with nature and morality, for many people, this reasoning just feels right. And it's the kind of reasoning that's been used by some extremely high-profile and powerful homophobes over the years. Anita Bryant, for example, who had, I'd say, a maximum of 3 talking points, had homosexuality being unnatural as a key cornerstone. One of her most famous quotes was, "A homosexual is not born, they are made. And because we are not born, aka we are not natural, we have to recruit, we have to make them. We're coming for your children." These logical leaps of fear-mongering ended up sparking a counter-argument that I think is best described as the born this way rhetoric. And no, this didn't start with Lady Gaga. In fact, at the same time that Anita and co were spreading the homophobic gospel, musicians like Chris Spira and Bunny Jones wrote I Was Born This Way, an explicitly queer anthem with lyrics like, "We're all the way nature meant us to be. I'm happy, I'm carefree, I'm gay. I was born this way." The born this way argument for gay rights is pretty simple. You're either born queer or you're born straight, and nothing can change that. It's not a choice, it's not a lifestyle, it's not a mental illness, it's just how some people are born. It's nature, not nurture. God loves you, we're all in his image. Take that, homophobes. And so we can see how homosexual behaviour in animals plays very neatly into this argument. After the 1999 publication of the book Biological Exuberance, the first mainstream publication to discuss homosexuality in the animal kingdom, queer activists started using this behaviour in animals to advance civil rights. In the year 2000, biological exuberance was actually cited in a petition against a homophobic ballot measure in Oregon that would ban public schools from teaching students about homosexuality and bisexuality. But here's the thing, why should we base arguments for civil liberties on the behaviour of animals? If queerness only existed in humans, would that make it wrong? Or if we discover that queerness is more influenced by nurture rather than nature, aka we are not born this way, does that mean queerness isn't real? What makes an identity valid, and who gets to decide that? Anyway, this is a video about asexuality. What is the discourse? That ominous name, the discourse, it's somewhat of a misnomer. It implies a singular event or belief or moment, the discourse. But when we talk about asexual discourse online, we're actually talking about a wide-reaching topic of debate that sprawled across social media sites like Tumblr, Twitter, and Reddit, primarily in the late 2010s. That debate centered around one question: do asexual people belong in the LGBTQ+ community? From that one question, a wave of asexual discourse descended, with participants taking one of two sides that I'll get into more in a moment. Countless posts were made, liked, reblogged, commentary added, tags were flooded with this discourse. Everything from long text posts filled with academic type writings to crude one-image meme posts. Combative and outright abusive and threatening language wasn't uncommon to both sides. This was an argument that mattered. It was treated as an online debate with very real consequences. Now, outside of the internet, discourse is a strongly argued discussion or point of view without negative connotations, often in fact with positive ones. But on the internet, the word discourse is synonymous with petty infighting, tedious reactionary opinions, and clickbait posts. An asexual discourse is, well, all of that and more. It is this intense condensing down of decades of questions around oppression, community, queerness, and history that's been scattered across the face of the internet for anyone to jump into. There's no arbiter of information, no fact-checking, no leading voice on each side, no rules of engagement, just the rule of law on the internet, which is to say, no real rules at all. In this video, I want to look not just at the history of the discourse and what the beliefs of these different sides are, but also what's going on here below the surface. Why the hell should we care, and what this reveals about the state of the queer community today. So strap in, grab a drink and a snack maybe, and let's get into this video that I've put off making for half a decade. A quick definition seems like a stereotypical, but in this case, very important place to start. Asexuality is often defined as someone who experiences little or no sexual attraction. In theory, this definition includes those with zero sexual attraction and those with other identities under this asexual umbrella, like demisexual, those that experience sexual attraction only after developing an emotional bond with someone, or the wider label of grey ace, itself an umbrella term for people whose experience of sexual attraction is not completely zero, but might be at a lower intensity or only under specific circumstances. Essentially in the grey area between no sexual attraction and typical levels of sexual attraction. However, in practice, this definition, though very broad, can be sticky. The specificity of sexual attraction as the key component may feel difficult to pin down for some people, when it might be tied to things like sexual interest, sexual libido, or sexual arousal. And as we'll see, an interest in keeping definitions and parameters around asexuality specific and enforced is a big part of discourse rhetoric. Whereas some models of identity change and flux depending on the experiences of those that relate to the terms, but not necessarily the exact wording that already exists for definitions. So, for example, people who aren't sure about the level of attraction that they experience, but do experience zero interest in sex. Whereas some models of identity change and flux depending on the experiences of those that relate to the terms, but not necessarily the exact wording that already exists. So someone who feels like they might be asexual, but they aren't sure about their level of attraction, they just experience zero interest in sex. Others would point to the definition as written to prove that that person technically isn't asexual, regardless of the fact that this definition was made up by people to reflect their experience rather than being some objective truth that can't be examined, expanded, or refined. So now I've basically begun with the idea that even the word asexual is messy. Let's get into the infinitely more messy specifics of the discourse. To start, let's look at what these different sides are all about. The discourse participants are split into the inclusionists and exclusionist sides. Inclusionists, as the name suggests, would consider asexual people inherently part of the LGBTQ+ community. Points of emphasis for inclusionists might be asexuality is a sexual minority, a form of queerness in that it is in opposition to traditional ideas of heteronormativity, the idea that not only are people straight by default, but that romantic and sexual attractions to people of the opposite gender are part of that default. Asexual people face problems due to their asexuality, including social erasure, medical mistreatment, and even corrective rape. To suggest that asexual people are not inherently LGBTQ+ is a form of asephobia or gatekeeping that shouldn't be accepted. Exclusionists, on the other hand, don't consider asexual people inherently part of the LGBTQ+ community, at least not due to their asexuality, although they may be considered part of it due to other aspects of their identity like their gender. Points of emphasis for exclusionists might be asexual people don't experience real oppression, or if they do, it's minimal or at an individual level. Asexuality is such a huge spectrum that it encompasses labels like grey and demi that exclusionists would regard as effectively straight if the sexual attraction that they did experience, whatever level it was at, was heterosexual in nature. The LGBTQ+ community is specifically those who are not cisgender and or are attracted to people of their own gender. Therefore, ace people who are romantically attracted to people of the opposite gender, heteroromantic people, aren't LGBTQ+. Asexual people are utilizing much needed LGBTQ+ spaces and resources. Asexual people's sexuality is only a matter of sex, and therefore is only information that needs to be shared with intimate partners, not a form of identity sexuality. These points are not exhaustive, but represent some of the logical conclusions each side's primary argument leads to, or indeed are relying on. And already you may have seen something going on here. There are points of evidence that directly conflict, but there are also points that seem to miss each other entirely. And that's because the two sides are often coming at the question with two completely different concepts of the very foundations of it. What exactly the LGBTQ+ community is, what it is for, what qualifies as an entry requirement. These are all up for debate here. For inclusionists, it's about things like belonging, self-understanding, a community for those who felt different because of their experience of romantic or sexual desire, or lack thereof. For exclusionists, it's seen more as a practical space of aid, monetary support, which is a finite resource to be protected, and is intimately connected to a history of oppression and suffering. Rowan's hot takes. At this point, I guess you're wondering what side I fall on here. And the answer is neither. I've been out as both asexual and a lesbian since before the discourse became a thing, and I've only spoken about it very rarely and in specific circumstances. Not because I don't have thoughts about this topic, but because the inflammatory and hostile environment online surrounding these discussions has basically just put me off. Because I actually have a lot of thoughts, but it's taken me until now to really feel able to talk about them. I guess this video is a classic video essay with a side of mini asexual discourse manifesto by Rowan. I've been worried about being quoted out of context, misconstrued, or actively harassed, but I feel like we're at a point of asexual history where we need to be having nuanced discussions. And I just keep thinking about how both sides of this discourse have the potential to harm some of the most vulnerable people within our spectrum of identity and community. I think the lens I've developed these opinions through is as someone who thinks about information and resources in a practical sense. What actual good will they do? Why do we encourage awareness? Who is this for? Who does it exclude? I've been involved in offline queer communities longer than I have online ones, and have seen the messy queerness of it all when you put theoretical ideas in practice with real people, and you have to consider those on the margins and fringes who might not fit neatly into definitions and existing language. I'm also very interested in questions that have repeated themselves again and again through queer history. Do we assimilate into society or seek liberation from these norms? And I've talked about that often on this channel. And so I'm going to give you my piping hot takes and give you some hypothetical examples to help explain how they might map onto actual experiences. Number 1, I do not think that being under the ace umbrella means that you are inherently queer or must identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community. However, if you do identify as queer, you are queer. If you consider yourself part of the LGBTQ+ community, you are. That openness to respecting self-identity is key to me. It leaves room for people who don't connect with LGBTQ+ or queer labels to still feel welcome in asexual spaces. 2, I think asexual experience is not always the same as asexual identity, but that work to benefit and respect one will only ever have a positive effect on the other, and on wider society. 3, I think it is actively harmful to try and fit into the born this way narrative by making blanket statements about all asexual people never being asexual due to things like trauma, disability, or other outside factors. Let's look at how the following examples will fit into this. Consider Sally. She is a straight, cis woman, very happy in her marriage of 30 years to her husband, the love of her life. But she begins the menopause and suddenly sees a total drop-off in sexual desire, and also pain due to hormonal changes when she does try to have sex with her partner the way that they used to. Or how about Martin? He suffers from chronic pain and fatigue, and his new medication has essentially shot his libido down to nothing. He's on that medication for 2 years, and during that time struggles with the uncertainty of whether his interest in sex will return, how to navigate dating in light of that uncertainty, and what that means for his conception of himself. Or what about Jason? He's a teenage boy who feels embarrassed about not quite being able to relate to the other guys on his football squad when they talk about girls and sex in a casual and easy way. He ends up in a relationship the next year, and through his emotional connection with his girlfriend, finds his sexual attraction for her now matching that of his friends. He ends up marrying her, and they stay together for the rest of their lives. His experience might be something he identified as demisexuality, or it might be chalked up to being a late bloomer, or maybe just understood as a facet of his heterosexuality. And finally, what about Emma? She goes through a life-altering sexual trauma and finds herself not just unable but uninterested in having sex with her boyfriend. Should she be cut out of access to asexuality as a label or community because her story is in opposition to these born this way validation narratives? To me, an insistence that asexual experiences fit into the tightly defined definition of inclusionist arguments, that to be asexual you must also be queer, for example, runs the risk of creating a barrier between real asexuals and these many experiences of those who ultimately would benefit from information, resources and support just as much, but might not fit the restrictive definition, or even want to. A resource about types of intimacy within romantic relationships beyond sex would obviously benefit asexual people who fit neatly into the definition, but would it not also potentially be life-changing for women like Emma or Sally and their partners? Discussions around the ways the ideals of masculinity have been so linked closely with sex over the years would be a brilliant topic of conversation amongst these real asexuals, helping tackle internalized stigma and potential issues of self-worth in asexual men. But wouldn't Martin and Jason also have vital points of view to contribute and comfort to gain from such discussions too? Activism around education within the medical field, increasing understanding from doctors around the existence of asexuality, would obviously help people who have never experienced sexual attraction from suffering with medical discrimination, but it would also provide options and less judgment for everyone who experiences a decrease in sexual interest, ability, or attraction for any reason. I understand entirely the reasons behind wanting to create boundaries around an identity. It serves to give asexuality a kind of legitimacy, makes it simpler to explain to people who have never heard the term. It provides snappy responses to ignorant and prejudiced viewpoints. But to me, these boundaries are in danger of becoming their own form of gatekeeping. Understanding asexuality only as one specific type of identity that's on a spectrum only as far as it relates to the exact nature of that inherent nature-given sexuality. For me, it feels more expansive and useful on all fronts to consider asexuality as also on axes of experience and identity. To me, applying absolutist statements to delineate clear lines through these axes about what all real asexuals are and aren't does more harm than good if our priority is helping people understand themselves, considering the relationship between their own wants and needs and what society expects from them, and tackling the wider areas of oppression that affect us all. I wanted to make a video about the discourse, a piece of asexual history that's still present today in many online spaces, because the context around it fascinates me, but I also wanted to use it as a jumping off point to explore the current conversations happening within and around asexuality. So in this video, we'll be looking at the hyper-digital history of asexuality, what happens when marginalized identities attempt to define themselves in the public eye, and what the hell community is even for, how more expansive conversations around asexuality can start to break down our well-established assumptions about everything from romantic relationships to what it means to be human. And speaking of desperately clawing around for some nuance, how are we feeling about the state of LGBTQ+ news coverage? Is that the death march of media criticism I hear? Because it's time to talk about today's sponsor with a quick ad from Ground News, the site and app where you can find collections of related news stories from across a range of sources so you can compare the different ways that these stories are covered. Take this example of reports on the findings of a new study on LGBTQ+ experiences in Europe. You can see the page includes summaries of how the story is covered by different outlets, with bias comparisons, information on the political leaning of each source, plus factuality scores and information on the owners of the news sources so you can assess the reliability and accuracy of information on current issues. Even a story like this one, digging into the results of a study, something many might assume would be fairly unbiasedly covered, can reveal differences in the emphasis of reporting, the inclusion or removal of additional information, or who's covering these stories at all. The right-wing coverage, for example, shares its statistics but without specifically politicized opinions, whereas the centre coverage is focused on governmental trust and legislative efforts. I think you can see how a site with this functionality might be useful when looking at coverage of things like queer news stories, which, under the wrong writer's bias, can become fear-mongering sensationalist attacks. Ground News allows people within the community, but also allies and those wanting to learn more, to access a wide range of sources and debunk misinformation in the same place. Plus, you can create personalized feeds, including specific topics that you want to be updated on, like particular queer identities and experiences that you might not see wide coverage of by single news sources, especially with their mix of mainstream and niche media outlets. My rule of thumb when I come across a news story or new information online is to fact check, and if it's something I agree with, to fact check it twice. Using ground news has been a great way to put that principle into practice, but also expand the stories that I'm seeing, especially ones pushed more to right-leaning algorithms, to help understand the ways bias, moral panic, and even subtle word usage can have an effect on how we see the news. If you want to give ground news a go, you can go to ground.news/Rowan or use the link in the video description to subscribe today, or even use the QR code on the screen. Signing up through my link will also get you 40% off the Vantage plan with unlimited access to all their features. Okay, back to the video. The slippery nature of the discourse. It feels entirely predictable in hindsight that such a debate would rage at this point in queer history. The late 2010s, we saw the rapid expansion of LGBTQ+ rights across the world, but particularly publicly in the US. The endless televised news debates about gay marriage. We had a rise in gay and bi representation on TV, trans characters, although played by cis actors, getting the tragic queer treatment on screen. There was a splintering of the community in many spaces, deciding between a push for mainstream acceptance through assimilation and actively rejecting the norms of straight and cis society. In such a world where LGBTQ+ people were increasingly seen as acceptable, where discrimination laws were passed and equal marriage was something that no longer shocked the nation, gay characters were popping up in kids' shows, we can see how for many there was a future approaching where the LGBTQ+ community was free of legalized oppression, where they were accepted by friends and family without issue, where the pains of the past were no more. What did a community which had absolutely been created around a shared oppression, danger and legal battles look like when those battles were won? For inclusionists, this idea of suffering as a prerequisite of queerness doesn't necessarily ring true. Although asexual people may well experience suffering because of their identity, those who don't are equally valid in inclusionist eyes. For exclusionists, the history of suffering is the basis of the community, and those who have historically been oppressed because of their attraction and gender identity clung together, not just for a sense of togetherness, but for their very survival. Keeping that community specific to those identities that put them under systemic oppression is about protecting those within it. Both sides ultimately are coming from two differing ideas of what community is for, affecting who they believe it is for. When people hear about this online discourse, it'll be easy to dismiss it as random teenagers arguing with each other on the internet. But these are questions that are in no way unique to the discourse. In fact, questions around community, belonging, political oppression, assimilation, deviance, survival, they've been asked since before the start of the modern queer rights movement in the 60s. They speak to the same wonderings that have inspired writers, activists, organisers and academics across decades. They're central pillars of lecture hall discussions of queer theory and of the creation of physical queer spaces alike. Part of the team at Asexual's site, The Asexual Agenda, username Siggy, wrote about the discourse as someone who has never engaged with it, but who emphasises its importance to ace history. The discourse is a forecast of the future. Ace activists of my generation have long speculated that after fighting ace invisibility, we might end up fighting ace antagonism. To those inclusionist asexual people participating in the discourse, this wasn't a hypothetical academic debate. It was a fight to establish a space for ace people going forwards. For some, this involved delving back into history to seek precedent for their inclusion, like the inclusion of asexuality with the work of Magnus Hirschfeld in the late 1800s, whose advocacy for sexual minorities included his Sexual Research Institute raided and burned by the Nazis, or photographs from queer and feminist activist spaces years past that included asexuality in their work, as evidenced by these images. But for others, it involved the creation of boundaries around what asexuality is. To prove that asexual people are inherently LGBTQ+, there were these oft-repeated phrases in the roster. Asexual people cannot be straight. Asexual people are born this way too. Asexuality being created by trauma is a dangerous myth. Emphasizing these absolutist statements as facts to further prove their intrinsic connection to the LGBTQ+ community. The use of statement as fact is presented across the entirety of the discourse, on all sides. Journalist Megan Hoynes analysed the rhetoric of discourse posts for a piece back in 2017, concluding about an exclusionist post. This post, like many others, assembles research, primarily consisting of self-analysis, that backs up each of its claims. Even though this user doesn't provide any outside research or support to back up their claims, their post has over 4,330 notes, or likes and reblogs from other users. As of this writing, almost 5,000 people reacted to this post in some way, and the reaction it received was largely positive, indicated by the number of likes and positive written responses. The popularity of this post is largely due to the way it's constructed. The post uses a question and answer format, making it seem much more official and informational than other, less organised posts. Before quickly adding, this is not to say that those on the opposite side of the issue are entirely innocent. Ace positive users don't provide sources on their posts either, and they often descend to the same passive aggression that's seen on the exclusionist side. In addition, arguments between both sides tend to escalate quickly into name-calling and blatant attacks against other users. These discourse debates can't be settled by the posts within them, and not just because they're coming from such different points of reference, but because it's not really what most of them are trying to do. These posts are most often not about genuinely trying to prove their side's arguments are objectively true with cited sources and good faith engagements with the concerns of the opposing viewpoint. Because the question of whether a group belongs in a nebulous community with no centralized governance, an array of experiences and intersectional identities, and a muddled history due to the necessity of hiding our existence for hundreds of years, it's not something that can be debated into truth, to my mind. There isn't a perfect platonic form of the LGBTQ+ community that we're attempting to measure up against. It's a term for a bunch of people created by other people to try and describe a whole host of people. Realistically, there is no one LGBTQ+ community. There are hundreds of thousands of spaces where community amongst us is found, in physical spaces and online, but there's no one community with a gate to be kept. And yet, people engaged in this discourse didn't see it as an arbitrary line in the sand. It was, still is for many, of grave importance. To dig into why, we need to look a little at the history of the internet. Into the internet time machine. Trying to pin down a simple timeline history of the discourse is a pretty impossible feat. There are a small number of academics who have written about this topic, but they tend to go with individual interviews with participants involved about their experiences over attempting a comprehensive timeline. And there are reasons for that. The nature of these platforms is often quite ephemeral. In Tumblr in particular, links cease to work when someone's deleted their account or even just changed their username. It's also decentralized and doesn't include public follow counts, so there's no real way of tracing popular accounts involved or universally known posts or crediting anyone with first status in regards to this argument. If we look at Google search data around the phrase asexual discourse, the results are basically non-existent before 2010. The few results we do get use the phrase that most people outside the internet might. Asexual discourse is a term for discussions within the community. Examples from these results include, originally I proposed the idea that sexual coercion and marital rape might be a fundamental human rights issue for asexual discourse to focus on, and I am glad this topic is being raised among people who are otherwise not likely to come across asexual discourse. I kept adding months to the search timeline and saw a similar use of the phrase in 2013 by user Lord Happy Toast on the AVEN forums. The relationship between lay asexual discourse and academic discourse about asexuality is a personal interest of mine, and it's something that I hope to see more research on in the future. Clearly thinking about so-called discourse as being more a sense of the discussions, themes, topics, and ideas around asexuality that were being discussed in a variety of spaces, from the spheres of academia to the day-to-day chats on the forums themselves. Yet by 2017, just 4 years later, the results included multiple people writing online about the discourse in roundup commentary full coverage mode. It was established enough to be worthy of discussion outside of its own bubble, but many of these blog posts and articles stand as an interesting example of the delicate nature of internet sources, with many links now being defunct and usernames of notable figures scrubbed from the platforms, making it almost impossible to trace back in any meaningful way. One of the pieces written around this time was a Medium article entitled The Rhetoric of Digital Ace Discourse by Megan Hoynes. In her article, Hoynes explains the way these online spaces, particularly Tumblr, encourage the intense partisan nature of the discourse. Tumblr has a tendency to foster argumentative and often toxic situations where misinformation is spread and users are attacked for simply stating their opinion on a particular issue. This has been a repeated problem for years on the site among numerous different fandoms and groups, usually culminating in mob mentality and blatant bullying. This kind of exclusive-based toxicity is not isolated to Tumblr alone. Other social media sites, including Reddit and the blog scene, have picked up on the arguments happening on Tumblr and are starting to emulate the same back-and-forth attacks. I think on Tumblr, this type of intense negativity is made easier by tools of the platform, like the ability to leave anonymous messages not attached to your account, and the fact that your account doesn't have to be connected to your real identity. But I think there's also something in the nature of these sites as wholly public spaces. spaces. Anyone can stumble upon the discourse. You don't have to search for it, just have someone you follow reblog it into your feed. And this means that it doesn't take any set level of interest or knowledge or understanding to participate. Everything here is public and shareable. It's not a specific group talking amongst themselves about their own issues. It's the internet equivalent of yelling into a loudspeaker. You might have one-to-one DMs introduced in the platform in around 2015, but those restricted interactions do not a community make. So we have these discussions about a community who've only really started forming in a meaningful way on a national and international scale, with members essentially forming concrete ideas about that entire community while watched and commented on by people who really don't have any connection to that community itself. Every person who posts about their identity or experiences can have that opinion held up as the opinion of the entire identity or experience. Nuance is often nowhere to be seen, less likely to gain traction in a space where we cannot really admit to our failings, but it also means we cannot ever be wrong in smaller ways, or be ignorant, or have poorly or partially developed views, or seek advice from each other to inform our opinions, or pursue new knowledge about the way we relate to other community members, or even discuss our own experiences. It might be easy to dismiss what is happening in these online spaces as something to ignore, knowing that queer and asexual spaces in reality will be far less hostile. But for many people, online spaces are the only option that they have. I don't think it's enough to rule them out as a lost cause, allowing these conflicts to fester and risk those that come across them descending into these narrow viewpoints, especially when, for all the examples of passive and active aggression in these posts, the harassment, the threats, there's also an element of empathetic concern to much of this content on both sides. As is pointed out in a literal thesis about the discourse written by Alyssa Smith entitled "The Discourse, an Online Debate," while conflict online usually evokes the spectre of the troll and his deliberate projection of effective invincibility, the discourse has a very different pattern of engagement. Discourse participants act from a great deal of concern for the most vulnerable among them, employing trigger warnings, delineating and enforcing safe spaces, and censoring content to avoid upsetting or alienating vulnerable groups or people. Both patterns of engagement are dangerous when not practiced in moderation. The troll style, for obvious reasons, focusing on winning and proving oneself more logical than one's emotional victim, can quickly lead to harm for the target of trolling. And the discourse, because concern for vulnerability can stifle speech about difficult issues or lead to the unintended creation of echo chambers. Particularly when the internet was the origin of the modern asexual community. It's an intrinsic part of our history and how asexuality has been conceived of as an identity. Before the internet, asexual people obviously existed, had been studied, were involved in activism, etc., etc. But the broad understanding of asexuality today undoubtedly formed through online spaces, resources, forums, and information sharing. And that's part of why these online spaces of the discourse feel so vitally important, because it's a landscape on which many decisions about the shape and form of asexuality as an identity and community have been made. The creation of the ace flag, decisions on specific labels under the ace umbrella, the decision to call asexuality an umbrella or spectrum at all, questions around what word to use for non-asexual people, it's all been played out online. We can see how the technological advancement of the internet is intimately connected to the development of an asexual sense of community. Nat Titman, founder of an asexual community space on LiveJournal in the early 2000s, one of the earliest asexual online spaces to exist at all, credited the rise of accurate and expansive search engines, particularly Google, for an expansion of asexual online awareness amongst ace people themselves. Things began to change in 2000 though, as people who had claimed the label asexual for themselves started to find each other and talk about their shared identity on the internet. And I'm inclined to pin this development on the rise of the superior Google search engine. My Life as an Amoeba received a handful of comments when first published, but started attracting a stream of long joyful responses from fellow asexuals as Google became more prominent in 1999 and 2000. This kind of sense of excitement and relief at finding people like you has long been a source of joy for marginalised individuals, but hit particularly hard for those asexual people who had literally never heard that their experiences had a descriptive word around it, let alone a potential community. Almost as soon as such technology was possible, it seems asexual people have been utilising the internet to create dynamic and participatory spaces for themselves. Not just static pages of information or resources, but places where conversations could be had, relationships formed, and support given on an individual basis. As part of my research for this video, I interviewed a number of asexual activists, academics, and researchers. This literally hours of conversations that I didn't have time to include in this video, but I'm planning on editing the full interviews as soon as I can and having them up on my my Patreon for anyone who's interested in hearing more full discussions. One of the people that I interviewed as part of my research for this video was Marshall John Blount, also known as Gentle Giant Ace, a black asexual activist and board member of Asexual Outreach, who told me in our interview,
I actually couldn't believe how ingrained the internet is in our community, especially reading the history of the first chat logs from the 90s to now. So it was very interesting that my natural choice was the internet to find community.
Looking back, in 2000, a Yahoo group called Haven for the Human Amoeba, presumably a reference to the aforementioned article, was created. In 2002, Nat Titman created the LiveJournal community that I mentioned a moment ago, and David J. created the AVEN forums, Asexual Visibility and Education Network, which is probably the most well-known and centralized space for asexual people online even today. Jay was inspired to create AVEN after himself joining Haven for the Human Amoeba and finding it lacked a focus on organizing that he thought was needed. Rather than compete as community spaces, Titman ended up significantly involved in AVEN, writing the original Big FAQ in 2002, which is a basis for various FAQ sections still on the site today. Jay has spoken at length about the process of forming AVEN, the ways it developed over the years, and its limitations as an online-only space. Users have time to review any given discussion going on and formulate a reply, making them ideal for tackling complicated issues of identity. However, these forums make poor arenas for organizing, where ideas and logistics need to be worked out quickly and decisively. An inability to act collectively or effectively hold conversations in real time greatly hinders the asexual community on AVEN's ability to transform their collective identity into collective action. For this reason, the community has focused almost exclusively on building and refining its notion of collective identity through strengthening its social network. Though the internet can be a powerful tool, or even the foundation of a social movement, in the end, it can only be an extension of real-world organizing. He is clearly one of the most influential people in asexual community building and awareness raising in the identity's recent history. Yet he's also a cis man who is heteroromantic, the exact kind of person that exclusionists would want to keep from LGBTQ+ community membership. Yet the more you read of Jay's thoughts on the topic, the more you see his very real awareness of how the breadth of intersections and experiences involved might impact the community. He's talked about the English language bias of the internet, the middle and upper class early access to the internet affecting who is able to form these foundational community spaces, and their tones, rules, and parameters. He's noted that a lot of traffic in those initial years came from people directly typing in the URL to his site or searching the word asexuality specifically, meaning that people would have to have some understanding of the use of the word to know how to access the community. As he acknowledges, Google's algorithms had decided that the most interesting thing about asexuality on the internet was my site, asexuality.org, and that reliance on Google was something that Marshall talked about as a more recent experience too.
It's definitely something I feel like I was born with. It's something that I didn't have the language to express how I felt, but until I was able to experience the magic of Google, because my sister-in-law, first person I came out to, um, she was like, maybe you're this, because I went to detail of how I felt. And when I saw asexual and the definition, I was automatically like, yes, I found my folks.
AVEN is well known for having a self-identity focused approach on their forums, realizing early on that a lot of people would come asking if they were asexual and wanting to discourage users from answering for those people, instead allowing them the space and information to decide for themselves. I think it's interesting to see the difference in the way these questions of asexuality, queerness, and community are perceived within the AVEN forums versus on these wider reaching public spaces like Tumblr and Twitter. One is primarily asexual people discussing their own identities, whereas the others are more open to commentary by those with no real connection to the community itself. It might be easy to think of asexual discourse as ace people versus non-ace people, but in fact, we see many disagreements within the AVEN forums themselves, debates about how to conceptualize asexuality as an identity, language used to describe the experience, including consideration of how this will be received by a wider non-asexual public outside of the forums. Beyond the Born This Way problem. From the start, the Born This Way rhetoric has faced criticism within the queer community for a number of reasons, including for those who experience their queer identity as an active choice. Cynthia Nixon, for example, faced backlash within the community when she publicly spoke about her own experience of queerness not aligning with that argument. In 2012, she said, "I gave a speech recently, an empowerment speech to a gay audience, and it included the line, 'I've been straight and I've been gay, and gay is better.' And they tried to get me to change it because they said it implies that homosexuality can be a choice. And for me, it is a choice. I understand that for many people it's not, but for me it's a choice, and you don't get to define my gayness for me. Notice how Nixon doesn't say that gay people aren't born gay. She acknowledges that for many that is their experience, but her experience happens to be different. She's arguing that A, she as an individual gets to define her own gayness, and B, the queer community shouldn't police who gets to identify as gay or not. However, many people spoke out publicly against her words. Journalist and activist John Aravosis criticised Nixon's speech in his blog, responding, "She needs to learn how to choose her words better, because she just fell into a right-wing trap, willingly. When the religious right says it's a choice, they mean you quite literally choose your sexual orientation. You can change it at will, and that's bull. Please don't tell people that you are gay and that gay people can choose their sexual orientation, i.e. will it out of nowhere, because they can't. And when you tell the NYT they can, you do tremendous damage to our civil rights effort. Every religious right hate-monger is now going to quote this woman every single time they want to deny us our civil rights. Thanks." Notice how his criticisms of Nixon revolve around the impact that her words will have with the political and religious right wing. The paradoxical phrase "falling into a trap willingly" stands out to me. It portrays Nixon as both the victim who's been trapped, but qualifies it with willingness. With this framing, Nixon, a queer woman, becomes complicit in her own oppression. He allows himself and his readers to make Nixon the target of his anger towards the religious right, despite the fact that Cynthia Nixon is not part of that group. He concludes with, "And when you say things like this, using incendiary buzzwords that don't really mean what you're trying to say, when you try to define the rest of us by your incredibly poorly chosen and incorrect words, you hurt us all. And finally, she's right. It shouldn't matter if it's a choice. But wake up, Mary. Lots of things in this life shouldn't matter, and they do." And so he agrees with the crux of Nixon's statement, that it shouldn't matter if being gay is a choice or not. But the fear comes from the perception of others. With his claims that Nixon sharing her experience hurts us all, I wonder who's included in that all. Is Nixon, or other people who don't feel like they were born gay but still identify as such? Like, 2012 was a weird time for gay rights all round. Glee was on the air, but conversion therapy was advertised on London buses, and gay marriage wasn't yet legalised across the US. The civil rights the queer community had gained, they were hard-won, but also shaky. I imagine that for this guy who came of age in the 70s and 80s, he's got a lot of fear around losing those rights. As I talked about in the opening, the perception of gayness being unnatural or a choice has long served as justification for the claim that homosexuality is immoral and therefore that we should be denied those rights. For those condemning Nixon's expression of her gay experience, instead of building the argument for queer rights around the community that exists, they're potentially shaping the community to fit into the argument. I see a lot of this fear within the exclusionist side of the asexual discourse too, where ace people are dismissed as outside queerness because they'll never be scared to walk down the street or fear being thrown out of their homes by unaccepting parents because of their sexuality. But ironically, if we define the queer community as people who have experienced homophobia or transphobia on a social level, then we're going to get a lot of non-queer people in that group. Straight people who are perceived as queer have also suffered from homophobia on a individual level. Cisgender people can suffer transphobia in that same way. I mean, we've already seen it with the way that trans policing of bathrooms has affected cis people perceived as being too gender non-conforming, too close to transness. This post, a classic example of a post within the discourse, argues that asexuality should not be included within the LGBT community, emphasizing oppression as justification for community inclusion, specifically oppression that derives from a very narrow definition of homophobia in particular. Homophobia here is defined as a systemic oppression of people who experience same-gender attraction, the implication being that since ace people don't experience this type of systemic oppression because of their asexuality, they don't need to be included in the community. But I mean, of course asexual people wouldn't experience homophobia because of their asexuality, but mentions of systemic oppression of asexual people as a concept is not present in this post. The exclusion of that language, that definition, by the author themselves is used as evidence of a lack of suffering or oppression altogether. And there absolutely is evidence of widespread anti-asexual attitudes affecting their experience with social systems. It's just not in this post. Yasmin Benoit's recent work with Stonewall in the UK is a testament to this, which she told me about earlier this month.
I was first made aware of asexual conversion therapy back in 2018, and it's something I've continued to hear about regularly since then, asexual people having very negative experiences in healthcare. And throughout my activism, I was also made aware of us not being recognized under the Equality Act, which means that we're not protected from discrimination across all areas. And I pretty much approached Stonewall with like a long list of grievances saying like, what are you guys doing about this? And their honest answer was nothing really. And that's kind of when I sort of coerced them into starting an asexual rights initiative with me and releasing a report into asexual discrimination in the UK, specifically focused on healthcare and the workplace, to detect areas for intervention and see what was going wrong. And it was also in 2018 that the British government released a national LGBT survey, which spotted a lot of the disparities in asexual experiences, especially in healthcare and in the workplace. Like, it found that we're 10% more likely to be offered or to undergo conversion therapy compared to other orientations. And we were able to build upon that research and add qualitative data to it so that we could hopefully campaign to make real legislative change for the asexual community in this country.
Moreover, that Tumblr post and those like it implies a uniformity in homophobia as a singular experience, even though amongst queer people who aren't asexual it still manifests in a variety of ways. Factors like disability, gender, physical appearance, race, culture, nationality, wealth, they're all going to affect your experience of queerness. A black lesbian's experience of homophobia may well look wildly different from that of a gay white man. The simplification of community oppression to provide an exclusionist gotcha feels like it does everyone in the community a disservice. But ultimately, if we get down to it, the idea of defining queerness by suffering is just not a tenable and long-lasting argument. Not just because some people may live lives where they haven't been personally touched by this kind of suffering, but also, yeah, oppression can shape our experiences of our identities, but for a lot of people, being queer is joyful. It's a gift to be queer in so many ways. And critically, queer people will continue to exist even long after homophobia disappears. And making that oppression disappear is surely a goal of the community itself. Unfortunately, while researching, I found that an internalized version of this rhetoric started to appear within asexual spaces in the 2000s and 2010s. Instead of debating who got to be queer, old Avon posts debated who got to be asexual. When the idea of asexuality as a spectrum started to get tossed around, there was a small but strong backlash to it with posts like these. I think the better term for people who aren't fully asexual is sexual, and the better term for people who aren't fully aromantic is romantic. Otherwise, you're just talking about when and with whom you're going to be one or the other, and no one except yourself and your potential partner needs to know that. And outside the community and folks involved with the community, the asexual spectrum comes across as a snowflake attitude. It's impossible to sell, meanwhile generating a crap load of new labels, including confusion inside that asexual spectrum. Anti-spectrum language discussions on Avon forums tended to worry about whether or not people outside the community would understand if these problem aces would be seen as special snowflake behaviour. And so this fear drives them to distance themselves from such people. And this kind of sentiment, called self-defensive othering, is very much an appeal to the dominant culture. It separates you from an other and redirects any potential hatred from you to them. It's the concept Dr. Megan Carroll, organiser of Ace Arrow's Scholar Support Network, spoke to me about in our interview.
And this happens with so many minority groups. Defensive othering is when you say, oh, I'm not like those people, I'm like this. Or we're not like those people, we're like this. So you will see that in any stigmatized group, form of boundary work of laying out who we are and who we're not. But as you said, that can be really tricky when you might be saying we're not like those people when those people are further marginalized by their experience of sexual violence, for example.
I brought up the idea of problem aces with all of the people that I interviewed, those at the edges who didn't fit into the Born This Way narrative, or people who might not identify as ace at all, and the impossibility of laying out imposed lines to define identity. People whose experiences of asexuality are temporary or caused by outside influences or complicated by other aspects of their identity. Dr. Canton Weiner, assistant professor of sociology and gender sexuality studies at Northern Illinois University, had this perspective.
There are certainly definitional struggles that happen within the community that I think are problematic and important to talk about. One of those that I find myself coming up against a lot is one you mentioned, related to disability and trauma. Because one of the main avenues of asexual erasure or denying asexuality as a legitimate sexual identity is this dismissal that sexuality isn't actually a sexual identity, it's the result of trauma or low libido or some other kind of disabled experience, and therefore it's not legitimate. And unfortunately, I think many within the asexual community, both in the past and currently, react to that by saying, no, asexuality isn't because of disability. Asexuality isn't because of trauma. And for most asexual people, I think that's true. It isn't related to disability and isn't related to trauma. But for some asexual people, that's another form of erasure, because in fact, their asexuality is linked with their experience of trauma or of disability.
I think it's important to understand why the idea of asexuality as a result of trauma, disability, and medical issues can cause a bit of a panic response, because it doesn't come from nowhere. There's a long history of medicalizing asexuality. In the 19th century, asexuality was diagnosed as sexual anesthesia or sexual coldness. And in the 20th century, according to an article in Scientific America, if someone reported being distressed by their low sexual desire, a doctor could diagnose them with hypoactive sexual desire disorder, HSDD. A person could also qualify for the diagnosis if their partner was upset by their low sexual desire, even if they themselves were fine with it. And since it was a disorder, it got treated. Still, even though the DSM has updated its standards and there's way more research about asexuality, people who identify as asexual are still perceived by many as treatable, even in the medical field.
Just anecdotally, I heard one person say that she went to a new therapist and said, well, I identify as asexual, I'm asexual. And the therapist was like, oh, okay, I'm going to talk you out of that. And so I just think that the way that conversion therapy is so normalized for asexual people, and the way that compulsory sexuality drives this assumption that, well, something must be wrong with you, or you must be lying about how you really feel, that is so dangerous. And for it to affect people's interactions with mental health professionals and medical professionals is so unacceptable. And I think there's still such a long way to go in creating more inclusive medical and mental health practices for asexual people. That is an issue that absolutely needs a lot more attention and more research.
A 2018 national survey in the UK found that asexual people were 10% more likely to be offered or undergo conversion therapy than other LGBTQIA+ identities. 2018, not like 1998, 2018, just a few years ago. To me, it seems like a lot of the online gatekeeping around asexuality not being caused by trauma ironically stems from the collective trauma of how asexual people are perceived in medical spaces. The survivalist mentality, while understandable, isn't exactly effective. It can get in the way of the goal of liberation and can, in some cases, further oppression, especially towards people of colour. When we're defining asexuality around opposition to acephobic attitudes or in relation only to the dominant white Western cultural ideas of sexuality and desire, we're also ironically ending up centering that as a norm around which we are orbiting. I spoke to Dr. Brittany Miles, assistant professor at UIUC, about ways that cultural understandings outside of this might allow a more expansive idea of asexuality as an experience, identity, and sexuality, and how more mainstream discussions about it might tie into conversations around Black liberation.
I think Blackness, in its freest form, Black embodiment, it is so deeply casually intimate and relational that it's not asexual at all, but it is divorced from these dominant ideas about sexuality and sexual orientation, even when we think about the intimacy of dance. I think when you see Indigenous peoples move and make dances and songs and tell stories, whether you're listening to spirituals from enslaved Black people in the US, whether you're listening to or watching videos of tribal groups across the globe, or seeing island communities doing haka, for example. There's something very visceral about it that shapes our ideas about the body in different ways. And so I think that it is fundamentally anti-Black to presume and impose sexuality onto Black bodies. And that's not to say to be Black and sexual are antithetical, but I think that asexuality is a piece of Black liberation. And because we live under a patriarchy in so many ways in our society, I think that requires a kind of feminism that is defined so much so by the current world we live in and the conditions established in it. And so I think that in Black bodies being free and free to move without the burden of sexuality, without the burden of presumed sexual availability, sexual desire, etc. I think that is the world in which asexuality becomes valued, becomes useful without condition.
During our interview, Yasmin too suggested that the racism within the asexual community stems from this assumption that all asexuals should have the same experience. In other words, the white experience.
Whenever I have tried to broach conversations about racism, it has not gone well. I have experienced a ton of racism within the ace community, almost more so than I have in any other spaces that I've been in. And it's not something that people are comfortable acknowledging in the same way as it's an issue in the wider queer community. Naturally, it would be an issue in ours as well. And I have definitely noticed some division that just comes with being Black and trying to speak about that in ace spaces. I think that we're all kind of under the impression that we're all facing the exact same issue and that it's an equal playing field for everyone who is asexual, and not taking into account that things like your race or your gender, your religion or your country or your language are going to make a difference, and that you still have those exact same biases that you need to overcome whether you're asexual or not. You still need to put that effort in. So yeah, that's something that I've personally noticed and experienced a lot.
For me, defining queerness and asexuality on terms set by oppressive parties will never lead to community or liberation. So how can we build inclusive communities? What resources are we stealing? Ultimately, this entire discussion leads back to the question of what a community is even for. If so many people are so vehemently arguing for or against the inclusion of an entire group, surely there must be some specific experience or element of this community that is at the centre of this discourse. A word that is constantly brought up is gatekeeping. Exclusionists are seen as gatekeepers, deciding who is allowed into the queer community, like bouncers at a club, I guess. And this isn't necessarily an inherently negative term. If we zoom out and look at why communities might need to be protected, technically any space that has limitations on who is allowed in could be seen as gatekeeping in the way the word is used online. Keeping minors out of BDSM and kink spaces, for example, that feels like responsible gatekeeping, right? It's a consent and safety issue for all involved. Not wanting police at Pride, that is both a current safety and historical intention-based form of gatekeeping. But it's used as a negative label by inclusionist users. And yet, in creating this narrow version of who is a real asexual, I think there's an argument to be made that many inclusionists are themselves gatekeeping the ace community and identity. These strict absolutist statements about all asexual people leave little room for the messiness that is ironically associated with queerness itself. When we think about gay versus straight as a dichotomy, the way our society defines straightness, any hint of a toe outside of 100% heterosexual desires, that means you're in gay soup, man. You're heading to Bytown immediately. But a toe outside of regular levels of sexual attraction and desire it's less immediately asexual. And so there is a greater difficulty in setting down any defined lines of where asexual begins and ends. And that uncertainty and expansiveness, I think, is part of that exclusionist fear, that there will be people who will identify as asexual who are too close to the normal end to feel different enough for them to internally, emotionally, and subjectively see those other people as queer. It's an openness that Brittany and I talked about at length.
One thing for sure is that I'm certain that we are uncertain. It is almost impossible to be certain about identities that emerge mostly, not just as a social construction, right? I'm a sociologist, we say that, but our identities emerge relative to the society we exist in. And so how people come to these identities is so limited mostly by the language we have, and language gives the illusion of certainty. And being able to name something and codify it and determine its boundaries with this seemingly certain language it lulls you into a type of comfort that is actually never there. And we've got to get real comfortable being uncomfortable.
When we talk about the queer or LGBTQ plus community, the magical thing at the other side of this kept gate, what are we even talking about? I mean, I've talked about this earlier, but it doesn't really exist. It's a series of friendships, groups, venues, collectives, online forums, group chats, and more. These individual communities are necessary for a whole host of reasons, including the mental well-being that comes with a sense of belonging, as well as organising in a more advocacy and activism-focused sense. Community, in the way that it's discussed in the discourse, is often tied to resources. Exclusionists talk about asexual people using up resources, not deserving them, taking up space that isn't theirs. This is an emotive argument on the surface, of course. The idea of fairness and being deserving of something you're given is something that a lot of people feel is important, especially in a space where we're dealing with marginalisation and equality. You want to protect people who need it, to make sure everyone is taken care of, to ensure a sense of equity. And so claiming that ace people are overtaking queer spaces where they don't belong and threatening already oversubscribed resources, that feels like an important issue to tackle. That's not right. These resources need to go to those that really need it. The implication here being that 1, asexual people couldn't possibly need these resources. 2, there is a selfish obliviousness inherent in inclusionist asexual people and supporters. 3, that said communities don't already have a way of prioritising resources and aid to ensure the most in need have first access. And 4, I guess that this is an actual problem that really exists. Because for the most part, I haven't really seen any concrete evidence from these community spaces that a wave of asexual locus has descended. A form of resources within a community space is the people within it, sharing experiences, advice, topics of discussion, questions, and potential answers. I spoke to Cody Daigle-Oriens, creator of online resource Ace Dad Advice, about the ways that gay and asexual spaces essentially provided the same form of community support resources at different times in his life.
When I first came out, I was growing up in the 90s in South Louisiana, a really challenging time and challenging space to be an openly queer person. And for me, it was other gay men, particularly older gay men who were in kind of mentor roles, who were the people who really helped me navigate that space. And it wasn't just like affirming or making me feel like valid as a gay person. It was also like practical ways of, well, here's how you navigate relationships. Here's how you navigate like dealing with other people. Here's how you come out. Here's how you navigate when someone rejects you. So it was both affirming the identity, but also creating a practical space and to show you how to live that identity as well. And it was enormously helpful for me. I don't know that I would have survived that part of my life without those figures and those people. When I did come out as ace for a couple, I came out as ace for a couple before 3 or 4 years before I started doing any kind of content stuff. So it was just something I kept to myself. But once I was in this space, I did recognize that there was a space in aceness for that kind of person, a person who is not just like affirming the validity of your identity, but also, hey, here's how you can maybe navigate relationships. Here's how you come out to people when you're unsure about doing it. I feel like what I'm doing is paying back the mentors who mentored me as a young queer person.
In her dissertation, Alyssa Smith quotes interviews that she conducted with exclusionists who were worried about the possibility of resource and space allocation. Cuddly Octo Carnival was concerned with gay-straight alliances, also citing as problematic cishet aces in positions of power in gay-straight alliances. To me, this feels like using current language use to justify decision-making as opposed to changing language to reflect actual community need. The phrase gay-straight alliance imposes boundaries on who is allowed in that space. If the group was called the LGBTQIA+ Society or even the Queer Ally Alliance, would this hypothetical scenario cause the same panic? I've been part of queer communities which have been overwhelmingly dominated by one demographic before. The LGBTQ+ Society at my university in my first year, for example, had identified the fact that the majority of membership and leadership were cis gay men. To try and change this, they introduced positions of leadership for people to represent their own identities outside of this, and split the highest position of president into 2 joint leadership roles, one of which had to be filled by someone who wasn't a cis man, with the other open to anyone. Within 2 years, the community had expanded to an unrecognisable degree, and when I left, there were proposals to use the same techniques to expand again to ensure queer people who experience other marginalised experiences were brought in to the same degree. As a community, we changed our constitution and ways of working to expand outwards. The inclusion of asexual people who need support is not a sign of a community eroding to me. It's an opportunity to expand who can be helped by that community. Another of Smith's interviewees, going by Sturdy Bassoon, said, "There's also the issue of taking up resources like homeless shelters and suicide hotlines, things that could actually save people's lives." And here is where I get tripped up on the logic the most. Because absolutely, people who are like prank calling suicide hotlines to stop users who need it getting through is bad. But if someone needs help and support from one of these hotlines due to their sexuality, asexual or otherwise, it feels bizarre to me to see this as something that warrants cutting them off from that resource, rather than spending your energy improving access to those resources so they can serve the multitude of needs. If someone is able to access an LGBTQ plus homeless shelter, it is because the organisers, social workers and volunteers involved deemed them in need of that service. Asexual people are not getting access to these resources through some nefarious deception. And if any are, that feels like an individual issue of dishonesty, not an identity-wide problem. A lot of exclusionists seem to want to claim that asexual people are all basically the same as straight cis people, with no real worries or oppression, but then also claim that they will use all the resources and aid. Like, something doesn't add up to me in terms of the reality of communities that I've experienced working with youth groups and queer societies, support hotlines and in-person venues and more. Because if we look at like queer domestic violence shelters, another example I've seen thrown into the mix, there are asexual people whose experience of abuse has absolutely been tied intrinsically to their asexual experience of sexuality. Coercive and non-consensual sex in relationships and the verbal and physical abuse that might tie into sexual denial are exactly the kinds of identity-connected complications that many specialist shelters and support organisations want to support people through. This kind of scarcity mentality that this new group will swoop in and take everything comes from a space of anticipatory fear of what might or could happen. So you can use examples of online posts where someone has written out a version of a community space that someone else doesn't agree with. Instead of working to create a space that would work for everyone's needs, where this initial post is seen as just that, an initial set of ideas that need to be brought in alongside other people's experiences and needs, plus practical implications and limitations. The way most communities have been built and altered over the years, one of Smith's interviewees, Fuzzy Pancake, spoke of their fear when you're saying LGBT centres have to have PDA, public displays of affection limits, or can't talk about gay sex. The only place we can talk about gay sex may be our homes, depending on where we live. We're barely providing for LGBT people. Giving this all or nothing example with the needs of this supposed interloper group eroding the safety of the space for existing community members because of their unreasonable demands, there's seemingly no space here to find a way for all people in the space to have their needs met. I spoke about this in my last video about OCD, but sometimes people in the same community will have opposing needs. That is where the conversation begins, not where it ends. We saw this exact same series of arguments when LGB-based charities and organisations were deciding whether to bring in the tea, as it were. Stonewall, one of the most prominent LGBTQ plus organisations in the UK, only officially took trans issues into its work less than a decade ago. I remember the discussions back and forth from all angles about whether it made sense. And these same ideas of limited resources, fundamental differences, fear of being overtaken were all present there too. What ended up happening was an expansion of collaborations, a better, more comprehensive set of educational resources, an increased understanding of the ways gender and sexuality can blend together in many ways, and a more cohesive community. A sense of belonging is often spoken about within inclusionist circles as a key part of community, yet for many that sense of belonging feels tenuous, even within the ace community itself. Yasmin spoke to me about her experiences as a very public asexual figure, for which she has received an endless stream of hate, invalidation and ridicule, but not just from those outside of the community.
I think it's very strange when people are able to have so many preconceived ideas about you, and also to be able to associate you as almost like a symbol for a cause or as a representative for a community, which, to be honest, I haven't actually felt that safe or included within the asexual community for most of my life, including now. So that's always something I've kind of had to battle with. And it's a very, like, there's absolutely no blueprint for it. There are very few examples of people kind of doing things in the way I'm doing it, and to like the scale I'm doing it, and in the places I'm doing it in. So it's quite an alienating experience, but I also wouldn't want to be doing anything else because I've always just wanted to do something that feels impactful. And I can't deny that this has been impactful, but it also has not been easy. It has not been easy, especially as like, I mean, I think in any aspect, being Black and being visible in the media is a risk. Being a woman and being visible in the media is a risk. And then being Black, asexual, and a woman, like you are, it's such uncharted territory, and it does feel like quite dangerous territory sometimes.
When I think about the asexual need for community and potential resources, it feels like a vitally important aspect of ensuring the mental well-being and physical safety of ace people. But it also feels like a lot of these resources, awareness raising and activism being carried out can have a wider benefit too. When I started researching for this video, I put out a survey online and thousands of people filled it in less than 24 hours when I had to close it so I wasn't too overwhelmed. Within these responses, I saw those hypotheticals that I gave at the start of the video. The menopausal woman, the man whose sexual interests had changed because of medication. Those examples have been these kind of hypotheticals that I would think about that were kind of a rhetorical illustration of how nuanced and expansive the experience of asexuality can be. But it's important to note that these aren't just hypotheticals. Here are some quotes from the survey responses that I got in just 24 hours. There's the question of identifying as asexual if you have asexuality due to medication side effects. I was in that situation at ages 18 to 21. It wasn't just low sex drive. I literally was not experiencing attraction anymore, not even to actors that I previously had liked. I still feel a huge sense of kinship to aces, and that time had a huge impact on me. But the question of what my relationship to asexuality is without it being something that I got over can be difficult, and the entire question of identifying as asexual under those circumstances is something different people have different opinions on. I think autism is a big part of understanding these parts of myself, because autism impacts how I have relationships differently than other people. I'm already weird enough, and my asexuality can add a layer of separation from normal. On top of that, being transgender, but liking my body and not wanting surgery, I'm not sure how to even conceptualize how I potentially have sex. As someone who escaped a really abusive religious situation based on purity culture, I'm reluctant to call myself ace because I was abused so much for my sexual desires that I honestly don't really have any desire for sex anymore. But I don't want to take the ace label because maybe that's not the true me. It just is the only sexuality that feels safe. My sexuality is hugely connected to childhood trauma, huge lack of trust and feelings of safety and insecurity, relational trauma, aversion to vulnerability, and lack of experience to draw on due to adolescence focused on things besides identity and relationships. To me, it feels like the type of communities I want to be a part of are the ones that open their arms to people with these messy experiences, even if they don't identify as queer or LGBTQ+, or even asexual themselves, because their experience of a lack of sex drive, a sudden drop in sexual attraction, a shift in their interest or ability to have sex, they feel so connected to those that claim asexual as an identity label, and there's so much support and information to be shared. But expanding who is part of these conversations also lets us question the boundaries of heteronormativity, which is the source of so much queer suffering and othering. Heterosexuality is the ideal and assumed default for everyone, and it's not just about who you're attracted to, but also how. Falling outside of that how is another experience that erodes the supposed truth of what romantic partnerships are supposed to be. It opens up questions around the sexual expectations on romantic partnerships, feelings of shame between partners where one wants more or less sex than the other, the often overlooked ways that sensuality, intimacy, and physical touch beyond the sexual play into human connection, and challenges the narrative that monogamous romantic love and sex are a universal human experience that should be the end goal of your life. Where do we go from here? I think ultimately the legacy of the discourse has me questioning how far we're defining ourselves for the purpose of an argument, redefined only by new arguments against us, not new experiences of asexual people themselves. That to me is a worrying place to find ourselves as we move forwards, because it limits us and our potential as a community. It's worth noting that this ACE discourse is just a small element of discussions around asexual experiences and identities, and many people I spoke to in offline spaces had no idea it even existed or was a point of contention. However, the questions it brings up around identity, community, resources, and oppression are being engaged with in a lot of other spaces. And I saw people with no idea about the original discourse who had still found themselves engaging with these ideas, taken by individuals from online engagement and into wider spaces. And many asexual people, even those outside of the discourse, still felt frustration at the lack of progress towards cohesive community organising. When I asked Yasmin what she sees as the purpose of her activism, part of it included this desire to go beyond the introductory conversations and towards a future where we're digging into deeper issues.
I also want those outside of the asexual community to be knowledgeable about who we are and what we're experiencing and the issues that we're facing, especially those that might not usually be in the spaces to hear these things. I kind of wanted to take the conversation about asexuality further in the sense of getting out of the 101 and making it more intersectional and like really tackling what needs to be tackled. And I also wanted to take it outside of our bubble because there are so many incredibly interesting and important conversations happening inside the asexual community that never go beyond our own chamber. So I've really just wanted to spread that initial awareness and then to kind of use it to empower real action and real change as much as I can.
Other people I interviewed shared a similar sentiment, that there's a merit in the difficult conversations. Brittany in particular spoke to me about the 3 aspects that she considered to make up a healthy community, joy and refuge being 2, which felt like 2 sides of the inclusionist-exclusionist coin to me. But she also talked about the importance of conflict.
I'd say a necessary component is conflict, tension, like room to not just disagree, but to interrogate the pieces of the puzzle that comprises what that is, to play with the boundaries and argue about it. And needing to do that, I think any community that exists in certainty about everything and everything in as a constant is a community destined to fail because it's committed to a particular delusion about who makes up that community. People are messy. We are messy and we are constantly moving, not just in and out of spaces, but in and out of our own identities in different ways.
This ability to accept and even celebrate the messiness of humanity was something that Canton saw was already present in the asexual community spaces that he was existing in. And he spoke to me about it as one of the best things that he saw in those spaces.
Profound openness to messiness of what asexuality means, a very broad acceptance that asexuality means a lot of different things to different people. It looks like a lot of different things. There is no single unified asexual experience. And I think that's true really of all identity labels. But asexuality, I think, is better at recognizing that actually than a lot of other communities are. And it's something that's very valuable about these digital spaces because you can also connect with people who live in very different parts of the world from you, which is valuable.
I think ultimately, as I look forwards, I agree with Cody that moving beyond these unanswerable questions of subjective community boundaries and into the practicality of support and potential can open up so many possibilities for the future.
Like, I don't know yet that we are, as a community, as it were, thinking about what does the future look like for ace folks? How do we assert our needs and concerns in the real world, in employment spaces, in housing spaces? How are we going to protect elder ace folks as they age into that space? We haven't quite gotten to that part of the conversation yet. And I think that becomes the place where you then start to build in the real world community and support structures. I certainly think as more people are recognizing that they are ace across a demographic spectrum, that becomes a more realistic thing. As I'm seeing more older ace folks, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, now it's starting to grow and more people are recognizing they are in this space, and then those people are going to find ways to rally around, well, here are what our common needs and concerns are, and we need to build things to support those things.
This is where I end up, as I think about all of this, which I do quite often, to be honest, looking to the future. I put off making this video for a long time because I was worried about the potential backlash of expressing opinions on the discourse at all, let alone opinions that didn't fit neatly into the 2 opposing sides. But it really does feel like we're at a tipping point. Asexuality has been in the process of emerging as an identity in mainstream spaces for years now, with ace representation on screen and on the page introducing many to the concept for the first time. But there has also been a huge amount of behind-the-scenes discussion, as it were, within the community, within these spaces that has dug really deep. I just don't necessarily think that it has bubbled up to the surface to become more of an open and mainstream conversation. We have work from academics that you've heard from in this video documenting asexual people's attitudes and preoccupations in this moment in our history. We have activists like Yasmin working with major queer organisations to bring asexual issues to the forefront. It feels like the time to ask, What happens now that we have the opportunity to move from an emerging identity to a community or series of communities that are able to organise around our issues and our joys? How do we take stock of what we want to change to make life better for anyone who touches the asexual experience, no matter for how long or for what reasons? How do we learn from the structures and methods of change that have been used before, but in a way that takes into account the specifics of asexuality while doing it? I'm not about to give you the answers to those questions, because I guess the answers, especially after the single-minded absolutism that started this dreaded discourse, can't come from one person. They have to come from collaboration, from community. I guess they have to come from you. Thank you so much for watching. As I heavily hinted at the end of the video there, if you have any thoughts, please put them in the comments below. I would love to read them. And also, read other people's comments, see what people are suggesting, what they're talking about, what kind of issues they're discussing. Reply, have a little conversation, and all that kind of good stuff. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I am going to have up on my Patreon as soon as possible some kind of edits of the fuller interviews that I had with these different experts. They were all amazing. They had such interesting and fascinating things to say. They're all extremely smart. You should go and look them up, follow them, see what they're working on, because they were absolutely fantastic. So if you'd like to see those or just support my work in general, I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description. I also just realized that since I last spoke to you all, the audiobook of my book Here in Queer is now out. So I will also leave a link to that in the description if you want to check it out. And until I see you next time, probably not from a hotel room in the sweltering heat, bye.